Hi everyone, my name's Inez Hsing, and as you can see, I'm a clinical optometrist based in Brisbane, Queensland. Thank you so much to the amazing team at Glaucoma Australia for inviting me to talk to all of you today about healthy eating and glaucoma. I understand this is the last Q&A session of the year, and that all the events have been really well attended and been very interactive. So I hope today adds a little bit more information, and hopefully we can give you some useful things to take back to your doctors and optometrists. So obviously one of the first questions to ask is, of course, why are we discussing this? Why is healthy eating something we want to cover? Many of us know that glaucoma, a lot of the treatments currently focus on lowering of eye pressure. But what we really want to highlight is more and more as all the research into glaucoma has taken place, is we know glaucoma is so much more than just pressure. It's literally, as you can see in this pyramid, just the tip of the iceberg. So yes, pressure is related to glaucoma, but we also know that an eye or an optic nerve that's under metabolic and oxidative stress is more susceptible to glaucoma damage, that there may be background inflammatory processes that harm the nerve. And of course, if there's impaired blood supply to the optic nerve, that can also be detrimental. There's so many different foods, diets, supplements that have been looked at in glaucoma management. So really, we can only cover the most common ones that have been looked into. And hopefully, if you've got any questions, feel free to shoot them through, and we'll try our best to answer them at the end as well. So I thought I'd kick things off with the flavonoids. So this is a really broad group of compounds which are found in many plants, and in foods you'll find them in dark chocolate, red wine, berries, and tea. Perhaps the most notable flavonoid that's been studied in glaucoma is Ginkgo biloba. So you may have heard your optometrists or your doctors talking about ginkgo. So ginkgo in the body is known to be an antioxidant. It helps to dilate blood vessels. It's an anti-inflammatory, naturally anti-inflammatory, and it also offers neuroprotection. So it protects the nerves, the precious nerves in our optic nerve, and also in the rest of our body. So ginkgo isn't just unique to glaucoma. There's been studies that have found it perhaps helps with peripheral vascular disease because of its dilating blood vessels properties, cardiovascular disease, and even cerebrovascular diseases like Alzheimer's. So in glaucoma, the most common recommendation is usually 120 milligrams of ginkgo daily. There's been studies to show that it helps to lower the pressure and protects the optic nerve. But also, what some studies have found is that it actually improved people's performance on the dreaded visual field test, the one where you've obviously got to catch the lights, no one's favorite. So, what was impressive with the visual field performance was that some people, not only did they show less rates of deterioration, some people did better while they were on ginkgo. So that was a small study, but still really promising. The reason why people did better on fields wasn't fully understood. It could have been because the nerve got more blood supply, but there was also some thought maybe there was increased blood supply to the brain, and that helped people's concentration and ability to do the field tests. Ginkgo is pretty well tolerated, so there's not too many side effects. The only downside to it is it almost certainly will need to be used on an ongoing basis to have those benefits we talked about sustained. Leafy greens, we always got told when we were younger to eat our greens by our parents, and there's a very good reason for that, because leafy greens contain high amounts of nitrates and nitric oxide. So these are compounds that are, again, antioxidative and neuroprotective, and there have been numerous studies that show that a diet that's high and rich in leafy green vegetables reduce the odds of developing glaucoma. Now, there have been studies of specific vitamins that are in leafy greens, like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, but at the end of the day, the evidence for taking separate supplements was fairly weak. And so more and more, a lot of practitioners just focus on having a diet that's rich in leafy greens, and that's probably going to be more beneficial and cost effective than taking supplements. So again, leafy greens are good for the rest of your body, so there's also the bonus there. Caffeine is a really big one, and I know we've already had a few questions. I can see them on the side panel, questions about caffeine coming through. So it's pretty well accepted that coffee consumption probably does tend to increase the eye pressure slightly by maybe 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury, and only for, as we said, very short-lived period of time, maybe a few hours. So there's been a lot of sub-studies, so some of these are even on the Glaucoma Australia website if you're interested in having a read, but that basically perhaps patients who are already at high risk, i.e. they may have a family history of glaucoma or they may be genetically predisposed to glaucoma, that those patients, if they have excessive amounts of coffee, so we're talking usually greater than 3 cups per day, that it does increase their risk of glaucoma. But in patients who don't have a high risk profile, perhaps the effect is lower or smaller. Tea, on the other hand, probably has less effect purely because there's less or lower concentrations of caffeine in tea compared to coffee. And as we mentioned before, teas actually have a relatively high concentration of flavonoids. So at the end of the day, most patients we would advise to have coffee consumption in moderation, but tea is a very good alternative if they do still want a little bit of the caffeine. Alcohol, this one is again a really big one, and it's a little bit controversial because there's been some studies that have shown alcohol might be actually beneficial for glaucoma, but then we have to be very careful to say what types of alcohol. And so it was actually red wine. So once again, red wine contains high concentrations of flavonoids, so that's things like your Pinot Noir or your Cab Sav, and so that they may actually be beneficial. On the other hand, there's been some studies that have shown perhaps alcohol has no effect or harmful effect. So in taking a very holistic approach, we always careful to say, again, if you have a moderation of your alcohol intake, that's probably the best way to proceed. The essential fatty acids, so there's obviously over the last 10 years or so been a whole lot of interest in essential fatty acids, or our polyunsaturated fatty acids. So these are our omega-3s and omega-6. The essential fatty acids basically help to modulate blood flow and cellular health. It's stuff that we often, our body can't synthesize as in great amounts naturally, so we rely on external sources of it. The role in glaucoma management, though, isn't as well understood. Some studies have found that taking too much high concentrations of essential fatty acids could increase the risk for glaucoma, and therefore the recommendation is to follow the National Health and Medical Research Council's recommended daily intakes. There's also been some studies that have looked at whether it's the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio that could influence glaucoma. So as a quick recap, omega-3 is primarily your fish and your seafood. So your fatty fish, as you can see, like salmon, tuna, nuts and seeds will have quite high omega-3, whereas omega-6 are more your plant-based oils. So things like sunflower oil, corn oil. So generally speaking, having perhaps the higher concentrations of omega-3 like fish and seafood is thought to be better in general health as well. And the last one I want to cover before we jump to taking questions from you guys is nicotinamide or vitamin B3, because already a lot of questions have come through about nicotinamide and vitamin B3. It's a relatively newer kid on the block. Its fundamental sort of mechanism of action is neuroprotection. So the idea that perhaps some of our glaucoma patients, the reason that they are at risk of developing glaucoma is because their genes, their mitochondria, which is basically the battery of the cells in our bodies, that they are susceptible to being dysfunctional. So nicotinamide or vitamin B3 in this situation sort of resets the mitochondria and regulates the mitochondrial health. So particularly again in patients who are perhaps at high risk of having mitochondrial dysfunction, nicotinamide is potentially very beneficial. So the most recent study that a lot of us base our recommendation on was one that came out of the Center for Eye Research. It was published in 2020, but it was a study that took place from around 2017 to 2019. It wasn't a huge sample size of 57 glaucoma patients, and these patients were randomized to receiving either a placebo, 1.5 grams of nicotinamide daily, and then eventually 3.0 grams of nicotinamide. So these people are randomized to have placebo, and if they were on nicotinamide, they started at the lower dose and then increased to the higher dose. The two cohorts were also swapped over, so then the placebo group got the nicotinamide and vice versa. And what was really impressive about this study, even though it was a small size, is that it did show, once again, just like with Ginkgo, the rate of deterioration on visual field actually was slower, with again some people showing improvement. And the other interesting thing was on an objective test, something called electrodiagnostic testing. The optic nerve seemed to actually, or the cells that feed into the nerve actually did better, and that wasn't based on a subjective test like visual field. It was objective measurements of how strong the electric signals in the back of the eye were. So there are foods you can eat or consume that naturally contain high amounts of vitamin 3. So you'll see again, it's fish, poultry, things like mushroom, legumes, those root vegetables. So this is a really good source of vitamin B3 that you can, in your own diet, consume in high concentrations. Having said that, often it is useful to ensure that if you want to comply with that study, that if you're taking supplements, nicotinamide is commercially available in most supermarkets and health stores. I have no affiliation with Nature's Own or Blackmores, but they are the two most commonly seen on the shelf. So exactly the same in terms of their concentration, 500 milligrams of vitamin B3. I think a question already came through from one of our Glaucoma Australia members about dosage. So you'll see in the study that patients were taking 1.5 grams daily at the lower dose, which is 1,500 milligrams, and up to 3 grams or 3,000 milligrams. So these tablets only contain 500 milligrams. So usually, if to match the results from the study, we would be recommending 3 tablets a day. There are potentially some side effects, however, with vitamin B3, such as gastro upset. So for most of my patients, if we're starting on vitamin B3, I might get them to start on 1 a day, take it on a full stomach, gradually increase to 2 a day, and see if they tolerate that well, then they can work their way up to 3 a day eventually. It's important to mention there's also a difference. Vitamin B3 comes in other forms like niacin or nicotinic acid. So you do want to be making sure that you're getting nicotinamide, because there's less of those adverse effects, so less gastro issues and also less facial flushing. So for example, niacin, which you can also buy from pharmacies or health stores, tends to cause people to get a bit more of a red flush on their face. So definitely check it's nicotinamide. So in summary, we would again say, so Ginkgo biloba, 120 milligrams per day may be neuroprotective for patients who have glaucoma. For patients who are not actually diagnosed with glaucoma, we don't know as much. There hasn't been as much research. So these are for patients who have established glaucoma. Essential fatty acids, not 100% sure yet on glaucoma, but ultimately follow the recommended daily intakes for both omega-3 and omega-6. Nicotinamide, as we said, 1,500 milligrams to 3,000 milligrams a day may again be neuroprotective for patients with established glaucoma. Leafy greens, have a diet that's rich in green leafy vegetables. Caffeine, try and not, we're not saying cut it out completely, but definitely, again, if you're someone who you know might be at high risk, you've got a family history, you're a glaucoma suspect, just moderate your intake to ideally maybe just 1 to 2 cups a day. And alcohol, not surprisingly, consume in moderation, and maybe consider the benefits of red wine over other types of alcohol. I want to leave off this presentation with a really important point, especially because I know a lot of you are going to be watching this and with a lot of interest. Healthy eating and lifestyle modifications still do not replace the need for conventional pressure lowering treatment. So it would be incredibly erroneous to say just because you're now taking vitamin B3, you can stop using your eye drops or whatnot. So it really is all part of a holistic approach to your glaucoma management. So often we'll have patients who are on drops or have undergone laser treatment, but who want to really make sure everything in their life is doing as much as possible for their glaucoma. So always discuss these things with your eye care practitioner. And as we said, being a holistic approach, as long as you're still following your treatment recommendations and management regime, there's no reason why some of these things can't be just done in the background to try and help as much as possible. The other interesting thing with doing things like lifestyle changes, there was a study that actually looked at what we call an illness perception quiz. So patients who did start to implement healthy eating and lifestyle modifications, they actually felt they had more control of their disease, they felt less burdened and less symptoms. So if nothing else, from a well-being point of view and a mental well-being, being proactive about healthy eating and lifestyle is good also overall. So I can see we've got quite a few questions on the side, so I'll start looking through them. And some of them we may have addressed, some of them we may have not. So what group of foods is good for the eyes, especially the optic nerve? So those were probably the main 6 that we talked about. So making sure not having excessive amounts of caffeine, alcohol, having recommended daily intakes of essential fatty acids. If you're suitable, having supplementation with ginkgo and vitamin B3, and then of course your leafy green vegetables. There's another question which we've sort of touched on. Is there any food or drink that can impact eye pressure, make it go higher or lower? Probably the main thing that we talked about was coffee and caffeine intake. That segues very nicely to something called the water drinking test. So for those of you who have done it, we sometimes in clinic do something called a water drinking test, which is where we ask you to not consume any water, usually for about an hour to 2 hours prior to your appointment. Then when you arrive to the clinic, we ask you to drink usually a litre of water, and then we measure your eye pressure at baseline before consumption of water, and then every 15 minutes for the next hour or so. The drink water test is akin to a stress test for your heart, basically because you haven't had any water, you're sort of reset to your baseline, and that impact of drinking so much water will actually show what your peak eye pressure might be, because we know eye pressures do vary during the course of a day. They tend to be highest, unfortunately, at the time we're least able to measure them, which is early hours of the morning. So the drink water test is a great way to simulate. I've seen people who can start with pressures of 10 or 11. They consume that water, and then by about 30-45 minutes, they can have peaked up to 5 or even 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury higher. So it's a really good stress test to see how much your pressure still goes up during the course of the day and how much stress it can handle. Apart from vitamin B3, I'll move on to the next question. What other vitamins are beneficial to eye health? As we sort of said, they have looked at vitamin A, C, E, D, calcium, zinc. I haven't had a chance to cover everything, but it's because ultimately the evidence for all of it was fairly weak. So no real other vitamins other than vitamin B3 are good for that have been really shown to be beneficial in glaucoma. The question could be broadened a little bit. What other vitamins are beneficial to eye health? As a little segue, there are some vitamins that are recommended for patients with macular degeneration. So we call them the ARETS vitamins, and they consist of things like vitamin C, vitamin E, zinc, lutein, and zeaxanthin, which are yellow pigments found in yellow fruits and vegetables. So they are more directed towards, they'll be branded in the supermarkets as things like MacuVision, lutein vision, those sort of things. So in glaucoma, their role probably is less beneficial, but certainly in patients with macular degeneration, they could play a role. How does food high in antioxidants help with eye health? So basically, oxidative stress is what happens with primarily, unfortunately, aging, that all of the cells in our body are currently, if you imagine, they run like batteries and they're constantly producing obviously a lot of energy, but they also produce a lot of waste products. We call them free radicals. So these free radicals, if they circulate in great concentrations in our body, unfortunately can be harmful to cellular health. So antioxidants, you can think of them as almost like the garbage truck that comes along and cleans up these free radicals and tries to reduce the amount free floating in your body. So that's how it helps with eye health. It cleans out all of the rubbish that all of our cells in our eyes generate, as we've done with a lifetime of seeing, and then gradually, hopefully, that would be less inflammatory for the eye and less harmful for the eye. I've got a question from Sarah Orders. What natural sleep supplements can you please have when you have glaucoma? I know valerian and antihistamines are out. Natural sleep supplements, so things like long-lasting melatonin, for example, or circadian is always a good option, and that doesn't have any impact. Usually, the impact of medications on glaucoma will tend to affect patients with what we call narrow angle glaucoma, where the drainage pathway of the eye might already be a bit prone to getting almost blocked off. So there are some drugs that you take that can cause further narrowing. So if you're already susceptible to that, and or you're thinking about taking a drug like that and you're not sure if you're suitable, have a chat with your optometrist or your eye care practitioner or your ophthalmologist. The other group of medications just to be careful with, sometimes you'll have read, is steroid medications, whether that's in tablet form or inhalers or so forth. Any steroids potentially can increase the pressure of the eye. So I always have a very, very simple rule about what supplements or what medications you can take if you're diagnosed with glaucoma, and that's always just chat with your doctor. And Melanie's question about vitamin B3, I think we've sort of addressed. So you have a shunt already in one eye and you're currently on 500 milligrams of vitamin B3. So short answer is yes, definitely taking it twice or even 3 times a day will get you closer to the concentration that was studied in that Centre for Eye Research study, obviously pending that you're tolerating it and that your doctor is happy for you to try and have that amount. A question about whether uncontrolled diabetes affecting glaucoma. Yes is the short answer, because the two conditions share very similar pathophysiology and etiology. So again, diabetes we know is impaired the blood sugar affects the blood flow to certain parts of the body. Glaucoma is also affected by that. So it goes both ways, that there's a higher prevalence of glaucoma in our diabetic patients, but there's also a higher prevalence of diabetes for our glaucoma patients. So short answer is, if you do have diabetes, and luckily, as you've just seen from healthy eating and glaucoma, what's good for glaucoma tends to also be good for diabetes. So you almost will kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Does being vegetarian affect glaucoma? So, good question. Obviously, if you're taking supplements like ginkgo and vitamin B3, that shouldn't affect it, or if you're vegetarian, you might obviously risk. We talked about the fact that vitamin B3 is in high concentrations in fish and poultry, so you wouldn't be getting it from those sources. But if you're taking supplements, then that probably is more than enough. Otherwise, you can have sometimes issues with iron deficiencies or folate deficiencies affecting the optic nerve. So once again, your doctor, if you're vegetarian, obviously your doctors are usually screening and doing regular blood tests, and they may need to make recommendations for supplements or oral supplements if you're low in those areas. Do leafy greens need to be cooked? No, not necessarily. So as we said, they will just naturally contain high levels of vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, zinc, all the good stuff. So you can cook them, not cook them. It's still, as long as you're consuming it, that's the important thing. Can ginkgo biloba be used instead of eye drops to lower pressure? As we sort of said, unfortunately, no. So none of the healthy eating recommendations replaces the need for having your conventional pressure lowering treatments. To date, pressure lowering is still the golden mainstay treatment of treating glaucoma. And we certainly don't want people thinking that they can be taking supplements instead. The supplements that we've talked about are more as an adjunct to complement what you're already doing, but definitely does not replace the need for it. And then I think lucky last, we're pretty much on time. Since leafy greens are good for your eyes and beneficial to glaucoma, does that mean adding salads to my meals daily? If you can incorporate it, I mean, a lot of us tend to you can get leafy greens and other greens, not even just into your salads. But yes, it's the recommendation, the daily intake of, five fruits and veg or serves, so forth. It's a difficult thing to ask. So if you can add a side of salad to your daily meals or have something on the side, then absolutely, if you can work that into your diet, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. I hope that was an informative session. And if there's any questions that we didn't get the chance to get to, or something that pops up that you're still interested in that you want to ask, there's an amazing team of educators that work for Glaucoma Australia. So happy for you to shoot them through. There's obviously endless resources on the website as well that you can tap into, and anything that's email there. And if there's anything that's particularly hairy, I serve on the clinical advisory panel alongside an amazing team of optometrists, ophthalmologists, and pharmacists. So between all of our brains, we can hopefully get an answer for you guys as well. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or tonight, depending on where you are. And I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas and don't overindulge on your Christmas goodies. And we'll see you in 2023. Thank you.